I made myself one promise the day my heart broke, and I believed nothing in this world would ever be strong enough to make me break it. Love was over. Forever. At least that was what Ryan Carter repeated to himself every morning as the Chicago skyline came into view through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown apartment. At 22 years old, he had already built the kind of career people twice his age admired. Yet every achievement felt strangely quiet after the relationship he had once believed would last forever ended without warning. Friends told him time would heal everything. Family insisted someone better would eventually appear. Ryan smiled politely every time he heard those words, but deep inside he had already closed the door. Falling in love again simply was not part of his future anymore. There was only one person who never tried to convince him otherwise. Lucas Bennett had been Ryan's best friend since their freshman year of college, back when late-night pizza and impossible dreams mattered more than resumes and promotions. Somehow, despite how different their lives became, they never drifted apart. Ryan spent his weekdays leading meetings inside sleek office buildings, while Lucas filled his afternoons teaching painting classes for children before working on illustrations in a cozy studio cafe nearby. They lived only a few blocks apart, and without ever planning it, they had quietly become part of each other's routines. Every Friday evening, they ordered takeout from the same neighborhood restaurant. Every Saturday morning, Lucas appeared outside Ryan's apartment, carrying 2 cups of coffee before Ryan even had time to make breakfast. Every Sunday, they wandered through bookstores or walked beside Lake Michigan, talking about everything from childhood memories to ridiculous internet videos that somehow made both of them laugh harder than they should. Ryan never questioned why those moments mattered so much. He simply assumed that was what best friends did. One chilly October evening, Ryan arrived home later than usual after another exhausting day of meetings. Before he even unlocked his apartment door, he noticed a paper grocery bag, sitting neatly outside with a handwritten note attached. It read, "You skipped lunch again, did not you? Heat the soup for 3 minutes, then eat every bite. I will know if you do not." Ryan laughed quietly before picking up the bag. Inside were homemade tomato soup, fresh bread, and his favorite chocolate chip cookies from the bakery around the corner. He shook his head with an amused smile. Only Lucas would somehow know he had forgotten to eat. Ryan immediately called him. Lucas answered on the second ring. "Please tell me you are holding the grocery bag instead of pretending you did not see it." Ryan smiled as he leaned against the hallway wall. "Are you secretly tracking me?" "No," Lucas replied with a laugh. "You become impossible to reach whenever work gets busy." I made an educated guess. Ryan looked down at the warm container in his hands. "Thank you. That is what best friends are for." The words settled comfortably in Ryan's mind because they felt completely true. Best friends remembered birthdays without reminders. Best friends showed up with coffee when mornings felt too long. Best friends knew when silence meant someone needed company instead of advice. Lucas had done all of those things for years without asking for anything in return. Ryan never noticed the quiet way Lucas's voice softened whenever he laughed, or how his eyes naturally searched crowded rooms until they found Ryan standing somewhere inside. Some truths become invisible when they are always present. Later that night, Ryan stood by his apartment window overlooking the glowing city lights while holding the still warm bowl of soup. For the first time in months, the apartment no longer felt quite as empty. He smiled to himself, believing he had already found the safest kind of love anyone could ever ask for, the kind that existed between lifelong friends. What Ryan did not know was that the promise he had made to never love again had already begun to change, not because someone new had entered his life, but because the person who had quietly stayed beside him all along was about to become impossible to see as only a friend. From that autumn forward, Ryan and Lucas slipped into a rhythm, so natural that neither of them questioned it anymore. Friday evenings always ended with takeout containers spread across Ryan's kitchen island, while an old playlist filled the apartment with soft music. Lucas insisted that every meal tasted better if someone laughed at least once before dessert, so he made it his personal mission to tell increasingly terrible jokes until Ryan finally rolled his eyes and laughed anyway. Saturday mornings belonged to coffee and bookstores. Lucas wandered slowly through every aisle, picking up novels simply because the covers looked interesting, while Ryan pretended he was only there for the coffee, even though he always left carrying another book Lucas had quietly recommended. Sunday afternoons often found them walking beside Lake Michigan wrapped in thick jackets against the cool breeze, watching sailboats disappear beyond the horizon while talking about dreams they once had at 18 and the people they hoped to become before 30. To everyone around them, they looked less like two friends meeting occasionally and more like two lives naturally woven together. Ryan simply never noticed. One afternoon, they stopped at a neighborhood grocery store before heading back to Ryan's apartment. Lucas pushed the shopping cart while Ryan read through a shopping list that Lucas had somehow already organized by aisle. "How do you always know exactly what I need?" Ryan asked with an amused smile. Lucas shrugged. "You buy the same cereal every week, forget vegetables every other week, and always run out of coffee before you realize it." Ryan laughed. "That sounds strangely judgmental." "It is observation, not judgment." By the time they reached the checkout line, the cashier smiled warmly as she scanned their groceries. "You two are adorable together," she said casually. "How long have you been dating?" Ryan answered so quickly that he almost interrupted her. "Oh, we are not dating." Lucas smiled politely beside him and added, "We are best friends." The cashier blinked before laughing softly. "Well, you certainly fooled me." Ryan chuckled all the way to the parking lot. "Can you believe that?" Lucas placed the grocery bags into the trunk. Without looking up, "It is not the first time someone has thought that." Ryan looked genuinely surprised. "Seriously? It happens more often than you think." Ryan laughed again, completely unaware that Lucas's smile faded the moment he turned away to close the trunk. Later that evening, they cooked dinner together in Ryan's apartment. Lucas moved comfortably around the kitchen, already knowing where every pan, spice jar, and cutting board belonged. Ryan leaned against the counter watching him prepare pasta with the confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. "You know," Ryan said thoughtfully, "if either of us ever gets married someday, our future spouses are going to be very confused by this friendship." Lucas paused for the smallest fraction of a second before smiling again. "Maybe." Ryan continued without noticing the hesitation. "I mean, nobody is ever going to believe we are just friends." Lucas stirred the sauce quietly before answering. "Sometimes people only see what is right in front of them." Ryan smiled. "Exactly." Lucas looked at him for a brief moment, then lowered his eyes with a gentle laugh that carried more emotion than Ryan understood. "Exactly," he repeated softly. After dinner, they settled onto the living room couch to watch a movie neither of them had been paying much attention to. Halfway through, Ryan accidentally fell asleep after another exhausting workweek. Without waking him, Lucas quietly stood, draped a blanket over Ryan's shoulders, lowered the volume, and turned off the bright lamp beside the sofa. He lingered there for a moment, watching his best friend sleeping peacefully with the faintest smile on his face. "Sleep well?" Lucas whispered so quietly that only the empty apartment could hear. Then he picked up his coat and slipped out into the cool Chicago night, carrying feelings he had promised himself would never become a burden to the one person whose happiness mattered more to him than his own. The following Friday arrived with an unusual silence. Ryan glanced at his phone several times during the morning, expecting the familiar message from Lucas asking whether he preferred Thai food or pizza that evening. Nothing appeared. He smiled to himself, assuming Lucas had simply become busy with work and buried himself in meetings that stretched far longer than expected. By the time the sun disappeared behind Chicago's skyline, Ryan finally walked out of his office carrying a laptop bag and more exhaustion than satisfaction. Instinctively, he reached for his phone again, only to realize there were still no new messages. For reasons he could not explain, the elevator ride down to the lobby felt strangely longer than usual. He arrived home expecting the hallway outside his apartment to hold a familiar paper grocery bag or two steaming cups of coffee waiting on the floor, but the hallway remained empty. Ryan unlocked his door and stepped inside. The apartment greeted him with perfect stillness. No music drifted from the kitchen. No movie trailers played from the television because Lucas had arrived early. No teasing voice reminded him to stop checking work emails before dinner. Ryan loosened his tie and looked around the quiet living room. "That is different," he murmured to himself. He prepared a frozen meal, something Lucas always claimed tasted like flavored cardboard, then sat alone at the kitchen island. Halfway through dinner, he realized he had forgotten to pour himself a drink. Lucas normally noticed before he did. The thought made Ryan smile for a second before the smile quietly disappeared. Later that night, he picked a movie they had planned to watch together, but after 15 minutes he paused it without really following the story. The apartment suddenly felt larger than it had ever seemed before. Saturday morning arrived without the familiar knock on the door. Ryan woke naturally, glanced toward the clock, and instinctively expected to smell fresh coffee. Instead, he found only silence. He checked his phone again. Finally, there was a message from Lucas. "Good morning. I am sorry I disappeared. The children's art program has a weekend exhibition, and I promised to help organize everything. I might be busy for another few days, but I hope you have a relaxing weekend." Ryan smiled while reading it, yet something inside him sank just a little. He typed back immediately. "No worries. Have fun. Let me know if you need help." The reply came almost instantly. "Thank you. I will survive." Ryan spent the afternoon wandering through the same bookstore they usually visited together. Without Lucas recommending novels, every shelf somehow looked less interesting. He picked up 3 different books before putting each one back, because he could almost hear Lucas explaining why another author would suit him better. Even the barista behind the coffee counter looked around before asking, "Your friend is not with you today?" Ryan shook his head. "He is busy." "That is unusual," she replied with a smile. Ryan nodded absent-mindedly. "Yes, it is." Sunday brought more of the same. Ryan walked beside Lake Michigan alone, watching waves roll against the shoreline beneath gray autumn clouds. Families laughed nearby, couples strolled hand in hand, and cyclists passed along the lakeside path, yet everything felt oddly distant. He stopped near the railing overlooking the water and realized he had spent nearly every weekend for years sharing these moments with Lucas. Somehow he had never once imagined the city without him beside him. That evening Margaret called to confirm a schedule change for Monday's meeting. Before hanging up she casually asked, "You sound tired. Everything all right?" Ryan looked around his quiet apartment before answering honestly, "I think I am just missing someone I usually spend time with." Margaret laughed softly. "That sounds like you have a very important person in your life." Ryan smiled without thinking. "He is my best friend." After ending the call, Ryan stood silently by the window overlooking the glowing streets below. He told himself he simply missed the routine, the conversations, and the company. Friendship explained everything. It had to. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small unfamiliar feeling had begun asking a question Ryan was not ready to answer. If Lucas was only his best friend, then why did the whole city suddenly feel incomplete whenever he was not there? Monday morning finally brought Ryan and Lucas back into the same city rhythm, but something subtle had shifted. Ryan arrived at the small cafe where they usually met before work nearly 15 minutes early, surprising even himself. He found a table by the window and checked the entrance every few moments without realizing he was doing it. When the bell above the door finally chimed, Lucas stepped inside wearing a dark green jacket with a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. His familiar smile appeared the instant he spotted Ryan. "You actually beat me here," Lucas said as he sat down. "Should I be worried?" Ryan laughed, relieved by how normal everything suddenly felt. "I figured I could surprise you for once." Lucas studied him for a second before smiling more warmly. Mission accomplished. They talked about ordinary things over coffee. Lucas described the children's art exhibition and proudly showed photographs of colorful paintings covering the community center walls. Ryan listened more carefully than usual, asking questions he might once have overlooked. He noticed the excitement in Lucas's eyes whenever he spoke about helping his students discover their creativity. He also noticed the faint shadows beneath those same eyes, evidence that Lucas had barely rested all week. "You look tired," Ryan said quietly. Lucas shrugged with an easy smile. "It was worth it." Ryan frowned slightly. "Still, you should let someone take care of you once in a while." Lucas looked down at his coffee before answering with a light laugh. "Maybe someday." The conversation drifted naturally after that, yet Ryan found himself watching Lucas in ways he never had before. He noticed how Lucas thanked the barista by name, held the cafe door open for strangers without thinking, and smiled at an elderly couple leaving with their breakfast. None of those moments were dramatic, but together they painted a picture Ryan realized he had somehow stopped seeing because it had become so familiar. Later that afternoon, Ryan returned to his office, only to discover a small paper bag waiting on his desk. His assistant smiled knowingly. "Your friend dropped this off while you were in a meeting. He said you would forget to eat again." Inside were a turkey sandwich, fresh fruit, and a handwritten note that simply read, Busy days still need lunch. Ryan smiled despite himself. He placed the note carefully inside the drawer of his desk instead of throwing it away with the bag. That evening, he opened the drawer again before leaving the office and looked at the note one more time. It was a simple gesture, yet it stayed with him all the way home. 2 days later, Ryan attended a company networking event at a downtown hotel. The ballroom buzzed with conversations about investments and partnerships, but none of it held his attention for long. During a break, he stepped onto the outdoor terrace and instinctively reached for his phone. Without thinking, he sent Lucas a photograph of the city lights stretching across the skyline. A reply arrived less than a minute later. Beautiful view. Did you remember to eat dinner this time? Ryan laughed softly. I actually did. Are you proud of me? Very. Someone has to keep you alive. Ryan stared at the screen longer than necessary, smiling in a way he had not smiled in months. When he returned inside, one of his co-workers noticed immediately. Whatever message you just received, she teased, it completely changed your mood. Ryan slipped his phone back into his pocket. It was just from my best friend. She smiled knowingly but said nothing else. Walking back toward the conference room, Ryan found himself wondering why hearing from Lucas could brighten an entire evening that had felt empty only moments before. He still believed the answer was simple friendship, yet for the first time another possibility quietly appeared beside that explanation, waiting patiently until Ryan was finally ready to see what had been standing beside him all along. The days that followed felt strangely different, although nothing obvious had changed on the surface. Ryan still worked long hours in his downtown office. Lucas still balanced teaching art classes with freelance illustration projects, and they still found time for coffee whenever their schedules allowed. Yet Ryan had begun noticing moments that once slipped quietly past him. He caught himself smiling whenever Lucas's name appeared on his phone. He started leaving work a little earlier on evenings they planned to meet, something he had never done for anyone else. Most surprising of all, he realized that the best part of his week was no longer closing an important business deal, but hearing Lucas laugh across a dinner table. One Thursday afternoon, Ryan received an unexpected phone call from Lucas while preparing for another meeting. Are you busy? Lucas asked. I have 10 minutes before I have to disappear into another conference room, Ryan replied. Lucas hesitated for a moment before speaking. I wanted you to hear something from me before anyone else mentions it. Ryan immediately sat a little straighter. What happened? Lucas took a slow breath. A publishing company in Boston offered me a full-time position creating children's books and educational illustrations. Ryan smiled instinctively. Lucas, that is incredible. Congratulations. Thank you. There was another pause. It is everything I have been working toward. Ryan nodded, even though Lucas could not see him. You have to accept it. Lucas remained quiet for several seconds before finally saying the words Ryan never expected to hear. If I do, I would be moving there at the beginning of next month. Ryan felt as though every sound inside his office suddenly disappeared. He stared through the glass wall of the conference room while employees walked past carrying laptops and coffee cups, completely unaware that his world had just shifted. Next month, he repeated softly. Yes. Lucas answered gently. I have been thinking about it for weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you. Ryan forced a small smile into his voice. I am happy for you. Really? I know, Lucas replied. You have always wanted me to chase opportunities. I still do. They ended the call a minute later because Ryan's meeting was about to begin, but he barely heard a single word discussed over the next hour. Charts filled the presentation screen while executives debated numbers, yet Ryan's thoughts remained fixed on one sentence. I would be moving there at the beginning of next month. That evening, Lucas stopped by Ryan's apartment carrying their usual takeout, trying to keep everything as ordinary as possible. They ate dinner, joked about a terrible television commercial, and discussed a new bookstore opening nearby. Only after the dishes had been cleared away did Ryan finally ask, Have you decided? Lucas looked down at the empty coffee mug between his hands. I think I have. Ryan swallowed quietly. You should go. Lucas lifted his eyes toward him. Even if it means leaving Chicago. Ryan smiled, though it felt more difficult than he expected. Your dream deserves a chance. Lucas nodded gratefully. Thank you for saying that. Later, after Lucas had gone home, Ryan stood alone beside the apartment window, watching the lights of the city shimmer across the river. He tried convincing himself that people moved away every day. Best friends stayed in touch. Flights between Chicago and Boston existed. Nothing truly had to change. Yet the thought brought him no comfort at all. Instead, an unfamiliar ache settled quietly in his chest, growing stronger each time he imagined weekends without bookstore visits, coffee without laughter, or evenings without Lucas walking through his front door carrying another paper bag full of things Ryan had forgotten he needed. For the first time since making that promise years ago, Ryan questioned whether the greatest risk in life was falling in love again, or letting the one person who had always felt like home walk away without ever knowing how much they truly meant to him. The final week before Lucas's departure arrived faster than either of them wanted to admit. Every familiar routine suddenly carried the quiet awareness that it might be the last time for a while. They visited their favorite bookstore on Saturday morning, lingering longer than usual between the shelves as if neither wanted the afternoon to end. Ryan noticed how Lucas absent-mindedly ran his fingertips across the spines of children's books, smiling whenever he discovered a new illustrator he admired. It struck Ryan that Boston was not stealing Lucas away. Boston was offering him the future he had worked so hard to earn. That realization should have made letting go easier, yet it only made Ryan understand how deeply he wanted Lucas to have every dream he deserved, even if it meant losing the person who had quietly become the center of his own life. Later that afternoon, they carried coffee to the lakeside path overlooking Lake Michigan. Autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk while a cool breeze rolled in from the water. They walked side by side in comfortable silence until Lucas finally spoke. "I signed the contract yesterday." Ryan nodded slowly, keeping his eyes on the waves. "Congratulations." "Thank you." Another silence settled between them before Lucas smiled gently. "You are taking this much better than I expected." Ryan forced a small laugh. "I am trying to be supportive." Lucas looked at him with quiet affection. "You always are." Ryan wanted to answer, but the words refused to come. Instead, they continued walking until they reached the same wooden bench where they had spent countless Sunday afternoons talking about everything and nothing. Ryan sat down first. Lucas followed beside him. The city skyline shimmered across the water while the late afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold. Ryan stared ahead for a long moment before speaking almost to himself. "Do you remember the promise I told you about a long time ago?" Lucas turned toward him. "The one where you said you would never let yourself fall in love again." Ryan nodded. "I believe that promise saved me." Lucas listened quietly without interrupting. Ryan took a slow breath, feeling his heartbeat louder than the distant waves. "I have spent the last few weeks wondering why the thought of you leaving hurt so much. At first I thought I was afraid of losing my best friend. Then I realized something that scared me even more." Lucas remained completely still. Ryan finally met his eyes. "The promise was never protecting me." His voice softened. "It was keeping me from seeing what had been standing beside me all this time." Lucas's expression changed almost imperceptibly, hope and disbelief appearing together. Ryan smiled with nervous honesty. "I kept telling myself that missing you was friendship, that looking for your messages every morning was habit, that wanting every ordinary day to include you was simply routine. But none of those explanations make sense anymore." He laughed quietly at himself before continuing. "Somewhere between coffee on Saturday mornings, bookstore visits, forgotten lunches, and all the little moments I never appreciated enough, I fell in love with the person who never once asked me to change my mind." Lucas lowered his eyes for only a second before looking back at Ryan, his own smile trembling with emotion. Ryan gently shook his head. "You do not have to answer today. I know Boston still matters, and I would never ask you to give up your dream for me. I only needed you to know the truth before you left." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze carried the scent of the lake while the first lights of evening slowly appeared across the skyline. Then Lucas reached over and quietly took Ryan's hand. His voice was almost a whisper. "I never wanted you to choose between your promise and your future. I only hoped that someday you might realize you were never walking toward either of them alone." Lucas's words lingered in the quiet evening air long after they had been spoken. Ryan looked down at their hands resting side by side on the weathered wooden bench, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly the moment would disappear like every dream he had convinced himself was impossible. Instead, Lucas gave his hand the gentlest, reassuring squeeze before smiling with the same warmth Ryan had relied on for years. "There is something I never told you," Lucas admitted softly. Ryan turned toward him. "What is it?" Lucas laughed quietly, almost embarrassed. I realized I was falling for you long before your last relationship ended. The moment I understood those feelings, I made a decision. I would rather spend my life as your best friend than risk losing you completely. Ryan listened without interrupting. So I stayed exactly where you needed me. I celebrated your victories. I helped you through your heartbreak. I reminded myself every day that loving someone does not always mean asking them to love you back. Ryan felt his eyes grow warm. Why did you never tell me? Lucas smiled gently toward the lake. Because you deserve time to heal without feeling guilty about someone else's feelings. You had already been through enough. Ryan shook his head slowly, overwhelmed by the quiet kindness behind those words. I spent all this time believing I was protecting myself, he said. Meanwhile, you were protecting me. Lucas looked at him with a tenderness that no longer needed to be hidden. I never regretted it. The sun dipped lower behind the skyline, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in years, Ryan felt the heavy wall he had built around his heart begin to disappear. There was no dramatic confession left to make, no impossible obstacle standing between them. Only two people finally speaking truths that had quietly existed for much longer than either had realized. They remained by the lake until the evening lights reflected across the water, talking about memories they had shared over the years. Ryan laughed as he remembered the first time Lucas had convinced him to visit an art exhibit he had expected to dislike, only to spend hours discussing paintings afterward. Lucas reminded Ryan about the disastrous homemade pizza they once attempted to bake together, the smoke alarm becoming the loudest guest at dinner. Every memory suddenly carried a different meaning. None of those moments had been ordinary after all. They had been the slow, patient story of two lives growing closer without either recognizing where the path was leading. As they walked back toward Ryan's apartment, Lucas quietly asked, "Do you still think I should go to Boston?" Ryan answered without hesitation, "Yes." Lucas looked surprised. Ryan smiled with complete sincerity. "Because I fell in love with the man who follows his dreams, not the man who gives them up for me. If we have a future together, it should begin with honesty, not sacrifice." Lucas's smile widened with visible relief. "You really mean that?" "Every word." They stopped outside Ryan's building, the familiar entrance suddenly feeling different because everything between them had changed. Lucas took a slow breath before speaking again. "Then let me make one promise." Ryan waited quietly. "No matter where I am, I want to keep choosing us. Whether that means phone calls, weekend flights, or finding a way back to the same city. Someday, I do not want distance to become the reason we lose something this important." Ryan felt a peaceful certainty settle inside him. The fear that had controlled him since his heartbreak no longer seemed stronger than hope. "I want that too," he replied. They stood there smiling at one another beneath the glowing streetlights, not rushing the moment, understanding that some beginnings do not need grand gestures to feel unforgettable. As Lucas finally turned to walk home, Ryan watched him disappear down the sidewalk, no longer with the fear of someone being left behind, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found a future worth believing in, even if the next chapter would begin with miles between them rather than the apartment building they had always shared. The morning of Lucas's departure arrived beneath a clear autumn sky that made Chicago seem brighter than either of them expected. Ryan insisted on driving him to the airport, refusing every suggestion that a taxi would be easier. The familiar streets they had traveled together countless times suddenly carried a quiet importance, as though the city itself was helping them remember every shared moment before the next chapter began. Neither of them tried to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. Instead, they spoke about ordinary things, laughing over an old story from college, debating which neighborhood bakery still made the best cinnamon rolls, and planning Ryan's first visit to Boston as though it had already been scheduled. It was not denial. It was hope finding its place beside uncertainty. At the airport terminal, they stood beside Lucas's suitcase while travelers hurried past in every direction. Lucas smiled gently. "I still cannot believe you woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning without complaining." Ryan laughed. "Do not expect miracles twice." Lucas shook his head with amusement before growing serious again. "Thank you for coming." Ryan answered honestly. "There was nowhere else I wanted to be." For a quiet moment, they simply looked at each other, understanding that distance would soon become real. Then Lucas stepped forward and wrapped Ryan in a warm, unhurried embrace. Ryan returned it without hesitation, realizing that for the first time in years he was not afraid of holding someone close. "I will call you when I land," Lucas whispered. "You had better," Ryan replied with a smile. "Otherwise I will spend the entire afternoon checking my phone." Lucas laughed softly before picking up his suitcase. He looked back one final time, offering the same reassuring smile Ryan had trusted through every difficult season of his life, then disappeared beyond the security checkpoint. Ryan remained standing there for another minute before finally turning toward the parking garage. The drive home felt quieter than any drive he could remember, yet beneath the loneliness lived something entirely new. He no longer questioned what Lucas meant to him. He no longer questioned what he wanted for his future. The only challenge ahead was learning how to build that future across the miles until life brought them together again. The weeks that followed settled into a surprisingly comforting routine. Every morning, Ryan woke to a photograph from Boston waiting on his phone. Sometimes it was the sunrise outside Lucas's apartment, sometimes a colorful bookstore display, sometimes a cup of coffee sitting beside a sketchbook covered with fresh illustrations. Ryan answered with photographs from Chicago, sharing views from his office window, the lake at sunset, or the bookstore they both loved. Evening video calls became the favorite part of every day. They cooked dinner together while separated by hundreds of miles, laughed over recipes that failed, celebrated Lucas's first published illustrations, and shared every small success as naturally as if they were still sitting across the same kitchen table. One snowy December weekend, Ryan boarded an early flight to Boston carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the excitement of seeing Lucas again. The moment he stepped into the arrival hall, he spotted Lucas waiting near the entrance wearing a thick wool coat and the brightest smile Ryan had ever seen. Without thinking, Ryan crossed the distance between them, and they greeted each other with the same effortless warmth that had always defined their friendship, now strengthened by complete honesty. They spent the weekend exploring quiet cafes, independent bookstores, and historic streets decorated with winter lights. On the final evening, they stood beside the Charles River watching reflections shimmer across the water. Lucas slipped his hand gently into Ryan's, and this time neither of them questioned whether the gesture belonged there. Ryan smiled as he realized something beautiful. Love had not arrived suddenly on a dramatic day. It had quietly grown through ordinary mornings, shared coffee, forgotten lunches, patient conversations, and a friendship strong enough to survive distance. The miles between Chicago and Boston had not weakened what they found together. They had simply proven that the strongest connections are measured not by geography, but by the choice to keep walking toward one another, no matter how long the journey may be. 1 year later, the first cool breeze of autumn drifted through downtown Chicago as Ryan unlocked the door to a place that had quietly become the heart of his happiest memories. The independent bookstore near Lake Michigan looked almost exactly the way it always had, except now a small cafe occupied the back corner where readers gathered with coffee, conversation, and well-loved novels. Ryan smiled as he glanced toward the familiar window table they had claimed so many Saturdays before. Someone was already sitting there, turning the pages of a sketchbook while a cup of coffee rested beside it. Lucas looked up, his face immediately brightening with the same warm smile that had welcomed Ryan through every season of his life. "You are 2 minutes late," Lucas teased. Ryan laughed as he pulled out the chair across from him. "I know. Traffic was determined to test my patience." Lucas closed the sketchbook and slid a fresh cup of coffee across the table. "I ordered your favorite before you arrived." Ryan wrapped his hands around the warm cup and shook his head with an affectionate smile. "Some things never change. The important ones should not," Lucas replied. Life had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined a year earlier. Lucas had completed several successful children's books with the Boston Publishing Company, earning recognition for illustrations that reflected the same kindness he carried into everyday life. Ryan had reorganized his work schedule, learning that success meant very little if he never made time for the people who mattered most. Eventually, his company opened a small Boston office, allowing him to divide his weeks between both cities until, little by little, distance stopped defining their relationship. They no longer counted miles. They counted shared mornings, weekend walks, handwritten notes left beside coffee cups, and quiet evenings spent reading together without needing to fill every silence. Looking around the bookstore, Ryan noticed a young couple laughing as they searched the shelves for the same novel. An elderly man sat peacefully by the window with a mystery book balanced on his knee. A little girl proudly carried an illustrated storybook toward her mother, unaware that the artist who had drawn its colorful pages was sitting only a few feet away. Ryan smiled as he watched Lucas notice the child and quietly wave. She waved back before happily skipping away. "She has no idea who you are," Ryan whispered. Lucas smiled. "That is perfectly fine. She likes the story. That is enough." Ryan studied him for a moment before speaking. "Do you remember what I told you beside the lake?" Lucas nodded gently. "You said your promise had been protecting you." Ryan smiled and slowly reached across the table, taking Lucas's hand just as naturally as breathing. "I understand it differently now." Lucas waited quietly. Ryan looked out the window where autumn leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk before returning his gaze to the man who had patiently changed his life simply by staying beside him. "I never actually broke my promise." Lucas tilted his head with a curious smile. "No." Ryan shook his head. "I simply met someone who taught me that healing does not happen by closing your heart forever. It happens when you trust the right person enough to open it again." Lucas's eyes softened with quiet emotion. "Then let us make a better promise together." Ryan smiled. "I was hoping you would say that." Lucas gently squeezed his hand. "No matter where life takes us next, we keep choosing each other. Not because we have to, but because every ordinary day becomes extraordinary when we share it." Ryan laughed softly. "That is a promise I will gladly keep." Outside, the afternoon sunlight filled the streets with warm golden light, while people hurried toward their own destinations, each carrying stories nobody else could fully see. Inside the bookstore, surrounded by shelves filled with new beginnings and unforgettable endings, Ryan realized the greatest chapter of his life had never started with a dramatic confession or a perfect moment. It had begun years earlier with a friendship built on kindness, patience, and unwavering presence. Sometimes the love people spend years searching for is already sitting beside them, quietly waiting until they are finally ready to recognize that home has never been a place at all. It has always been a person.